Hey guys, it's Mike here, and welcome to another segment on Dragon Ball Z. The topic of this video is one that I believe would have very interesting ramifications for Dragon Ball Z and the entire timeline. That topic is, what if the Supreme Kai came to Earth before the Buu Saga? Now, as we all know, the Supreme Kai came to the Earth during the Buu Saga in an effort to recruit the Z Fighters in order to prevent the resurrection and release of Majin Buu. This plan failed in the end, however, due to a combination of the Supreme Kai not doing enough research on the Earth, underestimating the powers of the Z Fighters, and not being forward-thinking enough. As a result, Buu was released, leading to the extinction of the entire human race and the destruction of the Earth. But what if the Supreme Kai actually was more forward-thinking and decided to come to the Earth earlier than he had? What difference could this actually make in the overall story and timeline? Well, let's take a more detailed look at this and find out. Now, considering that the Supreme Kai actually knew that Buu's shell was on Earth since it was deposited there, considering how he actually tracked Bibidi to the Earth and killed him after this happened, this would give the Supreme Kai a range of thousands or perhaps even millions of years in which he could have returned to the Earth before the Buu Saga. But for the sake of this argument, we'll just say that the Supreme Kai came to the Earth sometime during the events of Dragon Ball Z. So what exactly would happen depending upon when the Supreme Kai came to the Earth? Well, let's break it down by the saga. So let's start first with the Saiyan saga. So for this first scenario, let's first assume that the Supreme Kai didn't interfere with the fight with Raditz, as those events took place over such a short period of time. As a result, Goku probably still would have died and gone to train with King Kai. If the Supreme Kai had been watching during this period of time, it's likely this event that would have tipped him off, as a mortal training with one of the Kais is a very rare event. In fact, the only one to ever traverse Snake Way and train with King Kai before Goku was King Yama, and that was perhaps hundreds or even thousands of years before. At this point, it's likely that the Supreme Kai would allow everything to play out the way that it normally would have happened. Goku would train with King Kai, Gohan and Piccolo would train together, and the Z Fighters would train with Kami. At this point, the Saiyans would arrive and fight the Z Fighters. Everything that would happen after this point is pretty up in the air, considering exactly what happened in the original story. It is entirely possible that the Supreme Kai might step in once it's apparent that Goku will not make it in time to fight the Saiyans, and especially after some of the Z Fighters start to get killed. And if the Supreme Kai actually did the proper research and found out about the Dragon Balls and knew that Piccolo is connected to Kami, the god of the Earth, it's likely that he wouldn't allow him to be killed either, as in this case the Dragon Balls would become useless and he wouldn't be able to resurrect the rest of the Z Fighters whom he would need to help combat Babidi in the future. Although considering that Kibito can also teleport, it's very possible that he would actually go and meet Goku in the other world and teleport him directly to the battlefield. This way the Supreme Kai wouldn't have to directly interfere in Earth's affairs or insert himself into the battle. Although it's also entirely possible that he would allow everything to play out exactly the way it did to test Goku and the rest of the Z Fighters to see if they're worthy enough to fight alongside him. Although it's also entirely possible that the Supreme Kai might intervene once he sees that Goku is at a severe disadvantage against Vegeta in his Great Ape form, or perhaps even after this, once Goku is down on the battlefield and no one seems to be able to stop Vegeta. In either case, if the Supreme Kai were to intervene, considering just how strong he is, the entire fight would be over in an instant. Depending upon the Supreme Kai's course of action, there's three different things that could happen in this scenario. If the Supreme Kai intervened early enough in the fight, it's likely that the Z Fighters would all survive and the Saiyans would be killed. This would mean that there would be no reason at all for the Z Fighters to go to Namek to try and get their Dragon Balls, and it's unlikely that they would ever have to fight Frieza. However, if the Supreme Kai intervened either late in the fight or not at all, it's very likely that things would happen almost exactly the same as they did in the original timeline, aside from the fact that Vegeta might not be around. Considering the deaths of his friends, it's very likely that Goku would be very insistent on going to Namek and trying to use their Dragon Balls to wish his friends back. However, if the Supreme Kai intervened at the end of the fight between Goku and Vegeta and killed Vegeta, it's likely that Goku and his friends would all be at a great disadvantage considering that Vegeta helped so much during their fight on Namek. Also, if Kibito were to heal Goku and he were able to go with his friends to Namek right away, this would also put him at an even greater disadvantage, considering the fact that he wouldn't be able to use the Capsule Corp spaceship or its 100 times gravity to increase his powers to the levels that he originally arrived on Namek in. So even if Goku were to be able to get past Sarban and Dodoria using the Kaioken, if Frieza were to call in the Ginyu Force as he originally had, it's likely that Goku would not be strong enough to stand a chance against them, and especially not against Captain Ginyu himself. And in this case, even if Goku and his friends did get past Ginyu and the Ginyu Force, it's still likely that Frieza in his first form would be able to kill all of them with ease. So the only scenario where I can see this actually working would be if the Supreme Kai intervened early and ensured that none of the Z Fighters died. At this point, considering how the Supreme Kai knows just how powerful Buu was, and how powerful Babidi and his henchmen will likely be, and considering just how powerful the Supreme Kai is himself, it's very likely that the Supreme Kai will set about training the Z Fighters himself to prepare them for the eventual coming of Babidi. And considering the power difference between the Supreme Kai and the rest of the Z Fighters, and considering just how fast both Saiyans and Namekians make massive gains in strength, this would likely result in the Z Fighters becoming vastly more powerful than they would have been at the end of the series. So by the time the androids roll around, it's possible that even the humans would be able to take care of them. And yes, that even includes Yamcha. And by the time Babidi and his henchmen finally arrive, it would be all too easy for the Z Fighters to defeat them. And even Buu if he somehow were to be released. But what if the Supreme Kai came a little bit later down the timeline, say in the Frieza Saga? What would happen then? Well, this is actually a more likely scenario considering who Frieza was and what his place was in the universe. Up until his defeat at the hands of Goku, Frieza was an intergalactic tyrant and the biggest threat in the universe. Almost no other mortal even came close in power to Frieza, and not only did the Supreme Kai know of him, but King Kai, and it's very likely that the other gods did too. Frieza was responsible for the genocide and enslavement of a number of alien races, and the destruction of a multitude of worlds. And as the highest ranking god as well as the god of creation, the Supreme Kai was directly at odds with Frieza and his goals for the universe. Now with Frieza seeking to use the Dragon Balls to grant himself immortality, which would potentially extend his rule eternally, this would make sense as the perfect place for Supreme Kai to step in and put a stop to it once and for all. However, with the Z Fighters around, this makes the whole situation a lot more complicated. In this scenario, there's two different points that I could see the Supreme Kai inserting himself into the conflict on Namek. The first point would be after Captain Ginyu has brought all of the remaining Dragon Balls to Frieza. Just as Frieza didn't know that there was a password needed to summon the dragon on Namek, the Supreme Kai likely wouldn't know this either, and seeing that Frieza has gathered all 7 of the Dragon Balls would likely step in to prevent him from gaining immortality. Now considering how Supreme Kai in the series said he was powerful enough to destroy Frieza with a single blast, it's likely that he would be able to effortlessly defeat both Frieza and Captain Ginyu, especially considering that Frieza is in his most constrained form. The only other point that I could see this taking place would have to be during the fight against Frieza himself. And this would either have to take place during the initial fight with Vegeta, Gohan, Krillin, and Piccolo, or during Frieza's fight with Goku. At both points where the Supreme Kai could interfere in this fight, it's likely that it would result in the same end result. If the Supreme Kai interferes earlier, then Vegeta will likely survive. None of Goku's friends will die, so he won't need to turn Super Saiyan. Frieza will be effortlessly killed by the Supreme Kai and Namek won't be destroyed. Then with Piccolo still alive, they'll be able to resurrect all of the Namekians that Frieza did kill. And then with the Namekian Dragon Balls, bring back all the people who died during the fight against the Saiyans. If the Supreme Kai were to intervene later during the fight between Goku and Frieza, it's likely that he would intervene before Goku gets the chance to turn into a Super Saiyan. Once again, in this case, the Supreme Kai would kill Frieza and everyone else who has died would be resurrected with the Dragon Balls. In this case, the same outcome would probably happen that happened in the Saiyan Saga, with the Supreme Kai taking the Z Fighters under his wing and training all of them to combat Buu in the future. And once again, by the time the androids come around, the Z Fighters should be more than powerful enough to defeat them. This brings us to our last scenario in which the Supreme Kai could have inserted himself into the Dragon Ball Z timeline before the Buu Saga. The Android and Cell Saga makes perfect sense as a period of time in which the Supreme Kai would want to insert himself into the picture, considering the events that preceded it. With the defeat of the space tyrant Frieza at Goku's hands, and the death of Frieza and his father at Trunks' hands, the Super Saiyan has replaced Frieza in the order of the strongest beings in the mortal universe. So it only makes sense now for the Supreme Kai to show up and train the Z Fighters to overcome their upcoming obstacles as well as Buu in the future. In this case, I see 3 different points in which the Supreme Kai can insert himself into the picture. The first would have to be the 3 years of training before the emergence of the androids. With the knowledge of the future brought to them by Trunks about the death of Goku and the overrunning of the Earth by the androids, it's likely that the Supreme Kai would want to intervene at this point in the story and train the Z Fighters so that they can combat and destroy the androids when they arrive. And with 3 years training under the Supreme Kai, it's a certainty that the Z Fighters would be able to destroy the androids. And this would also leave Cell without any androids to absorb, which would make him easy pickings for the Z Fighters, just as it did Trunks in the future. The next point in time would have to be during the period of time in which the Z Fighters are reeling from their loss at the hands of the androids, and during the period of time in which Goku is dealing with the heart virus. This would have a similar end result, with the Supreme Kai killing the androids and maybe Cell as well. In either case, Cell wouldn't have the androids to absorb, so he would be much easier to defeat. The only other point that I could see the Supreme Kai intervening would have to be during the Cell game. And this would definitely have to be the most difficult and challenging of all the other scenarios. The reason I say this is that Perfect Cell is far more powerful than all of the other villains that Supreme Kai would have to fight before this. So this whole scenario comes down to how powerful Supreme Kai actually was, and there seems to be a lot of debate about this. Now of course the Supreme Kai said that he and the other Supreme Kais were powerful enough to take out Frieza with a single blast, so he's certainly above Frieza's level. But I would go one step further to say that he's either on or above Perfect Cell's level as well. Now a lot of this revolves around his fight with Piccolo. After sensing the Supreme Kai's power and figuring out who he was, Piccolo decided to throw the fight and give up. Now some say that this is Piccolo having respect for the Supreme Kai as a deity, as well as assuming that because of his standing in the universe he's the more powerful opponent. And of course because Piccolo was once Piccolo and Kami, he would definitely know full well just how powerful the other higher deities would be. However, there's also another side of the argument that states that Piccolo was actually weaker than the Supreme Kai, and a lot of this is backed up by the fact that Piccolo said this to Goku after he forfeited the match. In my case, I actually fall in the middle and think that it was actually both of these factors. In Piccolo's case, even if his opponent was more powerful than himself, it's likely that he wouldn't simply give up and not fight him. So it's a certainty that the Supreme Kai being involved is the main reason that he gave up the fight. However, in the original manga, the words that Piccolo said to Goku, that their dimensions were too different, has only ever been used in Dragon Ball to say that someone is far more powerful than their opponent. A perfect example of this would be what Tien said after he witnessed Goku power up into Super Saiyan firsthand against the androids. Not only this, but supplemental material such as the Daisenshu actually says that Supreme Kai is more powerful than Piccolo. So as far as I'm concerned, all of the evidence points to Supreme Kai actually being stronger than Piccolo. So of course this raises the question of how powerful Piccolo actually was. Some people like to say that Piccolo is on par with Semi-Perfect Cell, however I would have to say that that's really impossible. The reason for this is both Vegeta and Trunks, after coming out of the hyperbolic time chamber, were able to effortlessly defeat Semi-Perfect Cell and kill him if they so desired. Now as we know, before Piccolo went into the time chamber himself, he was way above the other Super Saiyans. Whereas they were all being defeated with ease by Android 18, Piccolo was able to fight 17 to a stalemate and arguably was more powerful than he was. Furthermore, Trunks' reaction after Piccolo exited the time chamber certainly implies that he grew more powerful than Trunks and Vegeta were before their second time in the chamber. And obviously this would mean that he would be vastly above Semi-Perfect Cell at that stage. Furthermore, when it came to fighting the Cell Juniors, only Piccolo, Vegeta, and Trunks were the ones who were able to actually fight back or stand a chance against them. So this would make sense that Piccolo would be on par with Trunks and Vegeta after their second time in the time chamber. Now the Buu Saga takes place 7 years later, and as we know, Piccolo is always training, and as he even said to Gohan, this is how he likes to spend all of his time, otherwise he'd become way too bored. So as a result of this, after 7 years of training, and considering the big gains that Piccolo has made in the past, I would have to put Piccolo around Perfect Cell's level at this point in time. And as a result of this, by default, the Supreme Kai would have to be more powerful than Perfect Cell. And this actually makes sense considering how long Supreme Kai lasted against Majin Buu. In fact, Supreme Kai actually took more blows and lasted even longer against Buu than Gohan did. And considering that Supreme Kai was able to restrain Gohan in his Super Saiyan 2 form, it doesn't make any sense for him to be weaker than Perfect Cell. So if Supreme Kai were to enter the Cell games and fight Cell instead of the other Z fighters, I'm pretty certain that he would win. As a result of this, Goku would never have to die and would be around to help train Gohan so he wouldn't get weak in the time of peace. And just as in the other scenarios, the Supreme Kai would help to train the Z fighters and give them another common goal to fight towards, just as Trunks did with the androids. As a result, they would be far more powerful than they were in the original timeline when Babidi arrived, and they would be able to defeat him and his henchmen with ease. Balls. So there you have it. I believe I've demonstrated exactly what would happen if Supreme Kai came earlier in the series. If he had simply been more forward-thinking and actually did his proper research, he would have been able to make a huge positive impact, which would have changed everything that happened in the Buu Saga. But unfortunately, none of this ever actually happened. Well, my name is Mike, and this has been another segment on Dragon Ball Z. Tell me your own thoughts in the comments section, what you thought of this video, and what topics you'd like me to talk about in the future. And if you have any other questions, don't forget to check out our Ask FM, which will be in the description. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as I always say, stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
And you better subscribe!